come in, join the Slido, ask questions and the like, and start on the aircraft poll, and we'll get started here in just a moment. Okay. So we'll start with our aircraft poll and go from there. Why is the June bug famous? Is it the first aircraft to complete a circuit of 1 nautical mile or more? The first controllable aircraft, first manned sustained flight, 65% of you, as of now, have the correct answer. It is the first aircraft to do that circuit. So Glenn Curtiss built the June bug. It was literally a prize that he was trying to win, and he was able to do actually quite a bit more than 1 nautical mile in his flight when he demonstrated that. Now, why is this important? What is different about this than, say, December 1903 with Wright brothers? What has happened in those 5 years? What's happened, yeah. Yeah, it wasn't motivated. That's just what they were capable of doing. So when Wright brothers launched their aircraft at Kitty Hawk, they literally used a catapult. It didn't have enough power to get off the ground under its own steam. It could fly sustained for a period of time, but it wasn't exactly the kind of aircraft you wanted to do a lot of maneuvering. It wasn't particularly stable. It really took all the pilot's concentration just to keep it going straight. By the time we get to Junebug, what we're demonstrating is all the stuff that's going to make an aircraft practical. It can take off under its own power in a range of conditions. You don't need a stiff headwind on a beach. It can fly, climb to an altitude, sustain itself at that altitude, be stable or controllable. It can maneuver meaningfully, and it can land. So yes, it was a circuit around the same field, but now we've got the ability to say, go somewhere, observe what's going on, take a package, mail, or maybe a bomb, to a place and deliver it, or drop it on someone's head. And it's all of those things that show that the technology has evolved in just a few years from something that is kind of a toy or kind of a demonstration thing to something that's basically practical. We didn't have much payload. It was just the pilot at the time. But it wasn't going to be long before we started carrying passengers and killing those passengers. In the case of the first one. Or carrying airmail and the like and further on. Okay? What is important about the 247? And it is that first stress-skinned, low-wing monoplane transport. Before this, all of our transport aircraft were built either on wooden frames or tubular steel frames or some combination, and over that was laid a skin to create kind of an aerodynamic envelope. It was often doped fabric, so in the case of the Wright Flyer, it was muslin, so a cotton fabric, or it was corrugated metal, something like that. What that meant is that the skin took the aerodynamic loads, but it didn't take any actual structural loads. As aircraft grew bigger, that becomes more and more of a problem because now I've got something that's effectively dead weight. By moving to stress skin design, for every bit of that design, I can make it lighter. The skin is now taking the load. And this is what we call a semi-monocoque construction. We have stress skin, we have stringers that run lengthwise on the fuselage, frames that run around. On the wing, we have stringers that run out spanwise, and ribs that hold the shape. And that makes our structure a lot more efficient. It allows us to do low-wing cantilever designs. We don't need struts and the like. The retractable gear allows us to fly faster. The smooth skin allows us to fly faster. It's just altogether more practical. So why was this aircraft not successful? Well, obviously the technology moves quite quickly at the time, so that would have always probably limited its success. But the main reason was what we see here on the fuselage. It says United Airlines. So in the late 1920s, Boeing had started an airline, Boeing Air Transport, mainly to fly mail and passengers around the Pacific Northwest. And they got it into their head they would join up with Pratt & Whitney, a company that made engines, one of the two aircraft engine manufacturers, big ones in the US at the time, the other being Wright Aircraft Corporation. And they would create a vertically integrated structure. They would build the aircraft, they would build the power plant, and they would operate the aircraft. And that formed what was called the United Aircraft Corporation and United Airlines. And this aircraft at first was only available to United Airlines. Now, other airlines, of which there were many, didn't like that. They complained to the US government, there was an antitrust lawsuit, United Aircraft and United Airlines and Boeing were split up back into three companies. And United Aircraft became United Technologies, which is now merged with Raytheon, I believe it is. Could be wrong on that. And Pratt & Whitney is still around. Boeing is still around. United Airlines are still around. But in the meantime, those airlines, the Pan Ams, the TWAs, the Easterns, the Delta Air Transports, they went to another company and said, can you design us an aircraft kind of like that? And Douglas came up with the DC-1, and then the DC-2, and then, of course, the DC-3. And the DC-3 is famous because it really is that first ubiquitous transport aircraft that was used by airlines all over the world to fly lots and lots of people. Now, more or less than 400 DC-3s actually built, and of course it says depends on what you mean. There were less than 400 DC-3s built as DC-3s. And they probably would have made more, maybe 500, which would have been amazingly successful at the time. Because keep in mind, the best-selling commercial transport that wasn't, say, like a DC-3, in the mid-1980s had only sold 1,800 and something aircraft. So 500 would have been big 50 years before that. But this little thing called the Second World War got in the way. The US Army Air Corps and other countries' US government wanted lots and lots of transport aircraft. They bought 10,000-ish of these. That's a lot. And at the end of the war, they were surplus to requirements. And the government sold them on to airlines at basically scrap value. So now airlines were able to buy an aircraft that was reasonably good, reasonably reliable, reasonably capable for nothing and operate it. And DC-3s went out and they opened up air travel and air traffic all over the world, and we're still operating them today. They're a great design. Douglas aircraft are extremely robust. And basically, until you destroy the engine or crash the aircraft, you can keep flying a DC-3. They fly forever. But most of those were C-47s, and it was that kind of combination of the Second World War that enabled it to go and grow so big. What would have happened if we had not had the Second World War, how things would have played out, I have no idea. Yes? Yeah, that's what most of them were done. They were converted to DC-3s, type certificate. Okay, what were the primary reasons that Boeing developed the 367-80, the 707 prototype? There were two reasons. First one was they wanted an aircraft that was capable of refueling the bombers they were building for the U.S. Air Force and not be on the margin of causing accidents. So at the time, the B-47 and the B-52 were being refueled by KB-50s. And that's basically a reworked B-29. So you were flying that aircraft as fast as you could go, and the B-47 and the B-52 were flying as slow as they could go. So if anything went wrong, the thing would stall and you'd have an accident. The U.S. Air Force didn't care. They didn't want to spend their money on refueling aircraft. They wanted more bombers. Bomb, bomb, bomb. So what Boeing did is they decided they were going to design this aircraft. At the same time, Pan Am and TWA were feeling out for something to replace their DC-7s and Lockheed Constellations and Super Constellations. Those, at the time, large four-engine transcontinental and intercontinental transport aircraft. The joke about the DC-7 and Lockheed Super Constellation, they were the best three-engine planes across the Atlantic, and they wanted something better. They saw what de Havilland was doing with the Comet, and they wanted something better than that. So Boeing said, we've got a potential market. And they used their own money. Now, it was money funded by the U.S. government, what's called IR&D, Independent Research and Development money. And what that is about 10% of every dollar you spent on a military program. They gave you that in money, extra money you could do what you want with. So if the program cost $100 million, they give you another $10 million to play with. Now, Boeing had lots of U.S. government contracts. The B-17, the B-29, the B-47, the B-52. They had lots of this money. They dumped it all into this program, and out came the 367-80. They then marketed that to the U.S. Air Force, and we got the C-135 and the KC-135, which is still flying today as the backbone of the U.S. Air Force aerial refueling fleet. And Pan Am and TWA said, great, we'll buy a bunch. Now what happened in the interim? Well, that pesky Douglas company, Donald Douglas, said, aha, we can design a better one. They came up with the DC-8. And they said, Boeing's design only seats 5 across. We will seat 6 across. Therefore, you can put more people on board, you can carry more, you can make more money, and it's more profitable. So at the last minute, Boeing was actually building fuselages at the 5 across. Pan Am and TWA said, we're going to cancel our orders unless you change it. They changed it to make it 6 across, and from that we have the fuselage cross-section that you have now on the 737. All because of that competition. Okay. What is the best-selling single certified aircraft of all time? 71% of you put the Cessna 172. We sold over 40,000, delivered over 40,000 of those. At some point, in terms of commercial transports, very soon, or may have already happened in orders, the 320 will pass the 737. Obviously, deliveries on the 737 are still a little well ahead. Now, but this is interesting. We're talking orders well north of 10,000 aircraft for both of those. In fact, the 737, I believe, has delivered their 10,000th, and the A320 also has delivered their 10,000th. In 1984, the 727 assembly line closed. They had delivered 1,829, I believe it was, aircraft. And that was the best-selling jet transport of all time. We're talking 7 times that on 2 things. Things didn't sell that many. 777 sold well over 1,000. A330 over 1,000. 747 over 1,000. 767 over 1,000. 757 over 1,000. But back then, 250, 300, 400 was a good thing. 1,800 was unheard of. Okay. We've talked about all of those. This is what replaced the DC-3. First, you had your 27s, your 37s, your A320s. Not the 707, not the DC-8. Things like the Caravelle, the DC-9, the Bach 111. That was your DC-3 replacement. They were designed to fly into similar airfields. And you can see that in their design. Okay. Which of the following facts about the B-29 are true? Was it the most expensive U.S. weapons program of all time at the time it was completed? Did it cost more than the Manhattan Project? Were more B-29s lost to engine fires than enemy action? Did the Soviet Tu-4, Tupolev-4, start out as a part-for-part copy? Can it be traced as one of the birthplaces of systems engineering, or did it meet its original performance requirements? Please answer that poll. You're welcome to discuss amongst yourselves. We'll talk about that a little bit, but you'll talk about it much more in the next few years. Yeah. Okay. Which of the following facts are true? The only one that isn't true is it met its original performance requirement. This is an aircraft that never could fly as far, never could carry as much as it was supposed to. It started off as a program in 1939 at the start of the Second World War, and the U.S. was under the impression that at some point the United Kingdom would fall. And in order to engage in its long-range bombing campaign, it would have to do so from hopefully someplace like Iceland, but potentially as far away as Newfoundland. And therefore issued a RFP, a request for proposal, to the manufacturers, Boeing, Douglas, Consolidated, for an aircraft that could carry a meaningful 20,000-pound bomb load, but down to 5,000 at longer ranges, from the west side of the Atlantic over bomb sites in occupied Europe and return. And All of the manufacturers responded. They were all extremely large aircraft, larger than any operational aircraft the U.S. had at the time. Now, what made this work? Why was this possible all of a sudden? Well, the U.S. was not what we would call an advanced aerospace country at the time. Most of their designs were crude but reliable. Things like the DC-3, robust. You can beat the hell out of them, but they aren't exactly efficient or long range. The U.S. heavy bombers, the B-17 and the B-24, they weren't as elegant as the Lancaster. They didn't have these beautiful Merlin V12 engines, liquid-cooled. They used beefy, robust, air-cooled radials. Maybe carried a little less payload, flew a little less distance, but very robust. But the U.S. had two advantages that no one else had. The first was what was called turbo supercharging. Now, as we fly up in altitude, our engines lose power. They can't produce as much power because the air is less dense. The way you recover that is you supercharge the engines. You compress that air before you put it into the engine. There are two ways of doing that. You can do it mechanically, and all of these engines had mechanical superchargers. That means you connect a compressor mechanically through a shaft and through gears to the crankshaft. And that's what the Merlin used and the like. The other way you can do it is put a turbine in the exhaust. And you can extract power from the exhaust and use that to compress. Mechanical superchargers are great. They're not particularly fiddly, or they are, but you don't have to stick metal in hot exhaust gas. But the problem is, as you go up in altitude, they consume more and more power. And eventually they consume more power than they allow the engine to produce extra power. A turbo supercharger doesn't have that problem. Now, the U.S. was so protective of its turbo superchargers that when they sold Lockheed P-38s to the United Kingdom, they took them off. The P-38 was known by the Japanese as the fork-tailed devil. It was a twin-boom, twin-engine, high-altitude pursuit aircraft, what we would now call an air superiority or interceptor. However, if you remove the turbo superchargers, it couldn't fly fast, it couldn't fly high, it was a dog, it was a piece of shit. And it was so bad with the turbo superchargers that came the P-51 program, which the UK wanted to buy into. They refused to use a U.S. engine, hence why the Merlin ended up in the P-51. But it worked well on these bombers. So now we can fly high, we can fly far, we're out of range of flak. We might be above the fighter aircraft that are attacking us. But 30,000 feet, which is the same altitude that B-17s and B-24s flew, it's freaking cold and it's low pressure. So you'd have to spend hours on oxygen, 10, 12, 14 hours on oxygen in heated suits. That's not going to work. You're exhausted. You can't do it for more than a few hours. For something flying across the Atlantic and back, not possible, let alone in the Pacific. But the U.S. had another advantage. Boeing, specifically, had proven pressurization. Lockheed also had done it. So we have a pressurized short-sleeve cockpit. Everything's now different. We can fly long-range missions, fly further. But we were pushing the envelope on everything with this aircraft. We also had computer-controlled anti-aircraft guns that greatly increased the accuracy. As a consequence, these engines were so complex and so cumbersome and burned so much oil that the range was often limited by oil capacity, not fuel capacity. They would spew oil onto hot exhaust, which would catch fire, light the magnesium components on the engine that would burn through the wing, and the wing would fall off. So we have a program that costs more than anything the U.S. had ever done before. It was well ahead. It was almost 50% more than the Manhattan Project, just to get fruition. It was behind schedule. It never met any of its goals. And then, in the early, when they started using them in the Pacific, because by the time they came in to play, you didn't need them in Europe anymore. If they were damaged, they couldn't make it back to where they flew from, so they would ditch over in the Soviet Union. The U.S. asked Stalin for their planes back. Stalin said no. He had them taken apart and had them copied part for part. And we got the Tu-4 from that. And it was such a good copy. The joke was that the computers, the mechanical computers that did the fire control, advanced Soviet computational technology by about 10 years. It's probably nowhere near that, but it was a noticeable advancement. And they were crude. And the part-for-part copies in the Tu-4 suffered from all the same problems that the B-29s did. They didn't fix or change anything. But it was such an overrun, such an expensive project, that the head of the chief science advisor to the U.S., Vannevar Bush, realized that we couldn't continue doing this. We had to come up with a better way of managing these programs. So he convened a group of experts to come up with something to do that for future, and that's what systems engineering came out of. And it's a process by which we break down our engineering, our aircraft and stuff into smaller, more manageable parts. We verify the requirements, we do our designs, and then we validate the program as we develop it. And it was that we used on Apollo that made Apollo possible, because without those advancements, there's no way we could have managed the Apollo program. Okay? So that's where all the money went. Some also-rans. These aircraft, the North American XB-70, the Concorde, and the Tu-144, are our supersonic cruise transports and the like. Well, one's a bomber. It went into service in reverse order, earliest, developed in this order, into service in that order. That never went into service. The nice thing about the XB-70, which was conceived as an intercontinental bomber to replace the B-52, it would cruise at Mach 3, have a 5,000 nautical mile radius, and be able to deliver 20,000 pounds of nuclear bombs to some unsuspecting person. It was obsolete, basically, by the time the prototypes were being built. ICBMs eclipsed it. Why take 2 or 3 hours when you can do it in 35 minutes? And then SLBM, sub-launch ballistic missiles, eclipsed that. But the beauty of the XB-70 is once it was canceled, NASA took over the testing of the two aircraft. There were originally 2 aircraft. And they've published almost all of it. You can go on to NASA Technical Report Server and find the handling qualities at Mach 3 of the XB-70. It was made of stainless steel. It advanced our clean room manufacturing technologies massively. Very important for the space program and the like. And that information fed down to everybody else. They could use it. The one sad thing about the XB-70 is we only have the bad one. They built 2 aircraft. The first one, which is the one that's still there, it was the one they tried everything out for the first time on. And it had lots of manufacturing defects and the like. It was limited to Mach 2.7, so it never really could demonstrate its efficiency, because believe it or not, if you weren't flying Mach 3, you couldn't fly as far. The second one had all of those problems rectified. The third one was scrapped before it was built, except for General Electric, who made the YJ-93 engines on it. Wanted a photo shoot. They wanted to have all of the GE-powered military aircraft in one nice photo shoot. So you had the F-4, the XB-70, the F-104, the T-38. And they wanted it to look cool. So the XB-70 has drooping wingtips, which were supposedly meant for what's called compression lift, to increase the L over D. And they did that. But the big thing they did, at Mach 3, they allowed it to be directionally stable, because that's a big problem. So they lowered those. Now we're flying supersonic. You don't need to do that. Creates massive wingtip vortices. The F-104 in trail got caught in that, came up, took out both vertical stabilizers and a chunk of the wing. It disintegrated, killed its pilot, but that ship too crashed, and we lost the good one, the one that could fly sustained for hours at Mach 3, and the like. But that was just a side. These individually were not successful programs, but for one reason or another, they allowed us to do something we couldn't do before. Probably the best legacy of Concorde was the proof that you could have a multinational European aircraft program. If there hadn't been the cooperation on Concorde, the French and the Germans and ultimately then the British wouldn't have created Airbus. We wouldn't have Airbus today. Okay, questions? We'll get to the top one that's left over from last time about Starliner. Is this stuff on planes going to be on the test? The stuff that it was in the videos really is potentially on the final exam. Most of the history stuff will be MCQ type stuff, ordering, stuff like that, matching, things like that. This is just kind of tying back into history. There's not a whole lot more. This is more for your edification. And the like. Well, I still owe you guys the escape velocity work through I'll put that up online here a little bit. Marks division for the final quizzes. The in-semester quizzes are half your total final unit mark. The final exam is half. And those are the quizzes are split. Is it 25? No. No, I've completely forgotten. Brain fart. The midterm quiz is 20%, and the other two are 15%. Oh. Who thought it was a good idea to use something flammable like magnesium for high temperature parts like those in turbo superchargers, and why? Turns out magnesium is a great material unless it catches fire. We use it a lot. Some aircraft use it in their brakes. The issue wasn't so much that it was in the high temperature parts. It was in the parts next to the high temperature parts. And had they not had oil fires and the like, it wouldn't have been a problem. But we use it for its weight. It's much, much lighter than aluminium. And in those conditions, in those areas, it's easily cast. It's actually a superior material. Just in those specific cases, it didn't work well. Yes? It catches fire quite easily in those conditions, too.
Aluminium?
Yeah.
Does steel do
it will burn, just not as readily. So magnesium is more flammable. If you're welding magnesium, you have to do it in an inert gas environment. Same with titanium, by the way. It'll do the same thing. It is weight, and weight matters a lot in these things. Sometimes that's the trade-off. What are the significant differences between the Tu-4 and the B-29? Okay, so early B-29s and Tu-4s, basically the same thing, like for like copy. Each country then continued developing the aircraft, and they diverged. The U.S. over time fixed a lot of those engine problems. The engines became a lot more reliable on the B-29. They then did a re-engining and a strengthening of the aircraft and created the B-50. That was even less reliable at first, and did that. The Soviets did different things, but it did allow them something different. Okay, we'll get to the Starliner question at the end, because it's I really don't know the answer. But no, those were North Americans that made the Thud. F-105 Thunder Chief was known as the Thud because that was supposedly the sound it made hitting the Vietnamese jungle. And the like. That was why they're called Thuds. Okay. Rotary wing. This is the king of rotorcraft now. The big one, the R4, is the big one. That Sikorsky is the one to remember there. And the DJI Phantom is really most rotorcraft built today are things like Phantoms. Okay, space survey. Give you a few minutes on that, and then we'll go forward. Okay, keep going on that while we do this, just to get through. Which launch vehicle was the first to reach over 100 successive consecutive launches? And as you can see there, it's the Delta II. The Delta II reached its 100th consecutive successful launch on its final launch. That's not saying all Delta IIs were successful by any means. They had failures in the 1990s. It just became, through use and constant use, extremely reliable. And it was the workhorse for a lot of NASA science missions and the like, and small comm satellites for a long time. It became obsolete. NASA and the Air Force walked away from it when the Enhanced Expendable Launch Vehicle program, the Delta IV and Atlas V programs, came to fruition. Even though it probably was perfectly capable launch vehicle for them, they just decided they didn't want to use it anymore. They were going to focus all on those originally. And then things like Falcon 9 and stuff has supplanted it. This one here was supposed to be the R-7 Soyuz, by the way, but I've screwed up the writing it in there. Atlas V is, I think, in the 70s now, and the like. So there's lots and lots of launch vehicles that are getting up there and all of that. Which launch vehicle now holds the record? And it is the Falcon 9. I get the years completely mixed up because the last couple of years have ended up in a blur, but it passed 101st successful launch was it June this year or June last year? I can't remember. But it's been going since. They're launching about 30, 35 a year now, and it's still been successful at getting its payloads into orbit. That's not counting the reusability success. But keep in mind, all of the rest of these are throwaway. You're not reusing them at all. So, with still any reuse of the basic booster core is a big deal. What was special, and I use that in words, about that record-breaking launch? It was a commercial resupply for the ISS launch. So, it didn't crash. No Jeff Bezos. It didn't fail. It was not manned. It was 101 in that case. Anybody know? It's special to us here at the university. Yeah. Yeah, it's the one that SOAR was launched on. It was deployed to a NanoRacks launcher on the ISS. So it just so happened that we were all watching that, crossing our fingers. The rocket went well. The docking went well. SOAR was deployed. It's working now. I think they had some issues, but it's working and functioning, and they're doing what they want to do. So that was just happened to be the one we put our spacecraft into orbit. Okay. What do you think was the single greatest achievement of manned spaceflight scientifically? Apollo 11, ISS, Hubble Space Telescope, Vostok 1, Gemini 6, Apollo 10. Could have put Apollo 8 on there, Salyut 1, Skylab. These were all firsts in one thing or another, or important. And it's up to you. Apollo 11, we all know about. The first time we landed on humans landed on another celestial body and returned to Earth. We have the ISS, which is both the most expensive single construction project ever, now over $200 billion, and the longest continuously occupied space habitat. Lots of good stuff. Hubble Space Telescope has changed cosmology, probably more than any other thing we've done, and the like. And it was manned space. We had unmanned ones that are up there. Vostok 1, of course, first manned orbit the Earth. Gemini 6 proved that we can dock in space, so enabled the Apollo program. Apollo 10 was the first time that we did a go out to some place, dock, undock, move people around, initiate a landing program, come back to Earth. Apollo 8, which I forgot to put on there, was the first time we left Earth orbit. Salyut 1, the first space station, and Skylab, the first U.S. space station. If I had to put my thing on it, I would say Hubble. Hubble's gotten more value out of it for more people than anything else. ISS is, in my opinion, a disappointment, primarily because they cut back the cool stuff, the stuff that would have really advanced science, because it was too expensive. And it became a project more about how they could work with others than about the outcome, which was fine. It's just not scientifically as nice as it could. Okay. There's a reliable one. Let's talk a little bit about this. This is the DCX. So we talk about Falcon 9, New Shepard, New Glenn, Super Heavy, Starship. They all owe their existence to this program. This was started by McDonnell Douglas in the 1990s to try to woo NASA into paying them to develop a single-stage orbit vertical takeoff and landing launch vehicle. They spent about $10 million on this, which is nothing, and they proved that a rocket could launch from a pad, fly horizontally, which is really what launch vehicles do. They go out horizontally, and then return to that pad or another pad successfully. Now, NASA, unfortunately, fell for the beauty of horizontal takeoff and landing, a Lockheed design, which they then funded, which then went nowhere. If they had funded this, or if McDonnell Douglas hadn't been cheap as can be and actually funded it, we probably would be having single-staged orbit reusable launch vehicles today. They may not be the most efficient design, but technologically, it was extremely doable. And you're seeing this technology both because it was NASA, made it available to everyone. Yes, it's export controlled, but anyone in the US can basically get a hold of it. But also the people that worked on this program then went to other companies, Blue Origin, SpaceX, and the like. That's the future that we have today. All because of this program, done on the kind of shoestring budget back in the 1990s. Space Shuttle. This is everything that's wrong with what happened out of the Apollo program. NASA couldn't sustain the Apollo program, either from a manpower point of view or from a budget point of view. But because Apollo was successful, they wanted to try new and innovative things. They wanted a fully reusable launch vehicle. They didn't have the budget. The US Air Force wanted a reusable launch vehicle to deploy and capture spy satellites, and we got Shuttle. It looks like this because it has to have 1,000 nautical mile cross-range capability. It also has to be able to lift something like a Hubble Space Telescope into orbit, to service it, to return it. And as a result, it's a horrible compromise. We have solid rocket motors that are not particularly safe and expensive. We have an external tank. We have a very fragile thermal protection system. If we didn't need that cross range for those spy satellite deployments, only needed 200 nautical miles, we would add a different winged vehicle design. It would have been a lot less likely to have failures. And we're seeing that. Things like Starship, they don't have that cross-range capability. They don't need it. So they're a little bit better designed and better prepared. Doesn't mean Starship's going to be a success. There are technology issues there. Things may or may not work. The folding fins are a big deal. But this is what happens when you try to do something that you're really not up to doing as an organization. Okay. Why is Starliner such a disaster? My first answer to that is, why is 737 MAX such a disaster? And my response to that is two things. One, McDonnell Douglas basically mentally took over Boeing. Cheapskates. They didn't want to spend money on things to do right. And the result of that was 787. Boeing cut their management costs on 787. 777 was extremely successful, but they didn't like how much money they spent on management. Because McDonnell Douglas, they cut it. We got 787. It went so pear-shaped to the tune of costing Boeing sunk cost of over $40 billion. And it's a company like Boeing, the size of Boeing, that they can afford that loss. They couldn't have things fail. They didn't want to spend the money. And you got these horrible corners that are 737 MAX, because they didn't have the engineers, because they were fixing 787, and Starliner. And they're just not there. SpaceX didn't care. Who cared if Dragons failed? They would have failed. Whoop-de-doo. Boeing didn't want to behave like that. And we have Starliner. So it's one niggling thing after the other. Okay. You're welcome to answer this. I thought I'd reset this. What's my favorite aircraft for our last thing before we go into any further questions? So, R is the key thing. I don't have a rotorcraft. So the Flying Banana, which is up there, the Paiseki Flying Banana is a pretty cool one. It's the progenitor to things like the Chinook So those tandem rotor helicopters. But I don't really have a rotorcraft. So the big one in the middle, that is probably my favorite high-speed aircraft, the XB-70. It isn't a practical aircraft, but nor was Concorde in reality. And there is something sweet about going Mach 3 at sustained in a package that's a bit more practical, potentially usable than something like an SR-71. Like the SR-71, it had effectively turbo ramjets, which is pretty cool. And it advanced that stainless steel art that we talked about in manufacturing. It gave us, ultimately, designs and information that allowed people to build Concorde and the like. Concorde was ultimately a failure. British Airways bought their copies at £1 apiece. Air France paid nothing. The governments wrote off the development cost, though they could operate them profitably in limited use for quite a while. Commercial transport-wise, the special place in my heart is the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, which was also a total failure as a program. It cost Lockheed more to assemble each one than they could sell them for. It was part of the dog-eat-dog world of the tri-jets in the 70s that destroyed Douglas, forced the U.S. government to merge them with McDonnell, which was the end of that, which caused that long downhill slide. Lockheed was bailed out by the U.S. government because they were going to go under. The Defense Department couldn't have that. Rolls-Royce was nationalized, but there are some systems on the L-1011, all analog, 1960s technology. They are capable of doing things that we're only starting to get back now. Up there with that are things like the Hawker-Siddeley Trident, which was the first Cat 3C capable aircraft. You know how many aircraft you can land in Cat 3C capable in Cat 3C conditions on a runway? 1. Because at the time they could land, but there was no visibility to actually get off the runway, so they'd have to close the runway until it cleared up. But technologically it was pretty improvement. Now, I told you, the XB-70 and the L-1011 TriStar are the two. There's a few other ones in specific categories, but those hold a special place. Okay, so next week is review. Watch the video, come with questions, and work our way through them and the like. I'll see you then. One last question in the Q&A. What does it say? Did any aerospace aeronautical projects end up under budget? Yeah, actually there are a few, but they're not that common. A good one was the 777 300ER 200LR. That was under budget and better performance. But they're relatively few and far between because we tend to do a lot with each project and they tend to run away. And especially if they're too big to fail, they'll always end up in the wrong place. Okay, thanks guys.
You're very welcome.